If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit thedihedral.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on!
Climb on! Roll! All right, so thanks for joining us on another episode of the Dihedral Podcast. This is Carrot. Today we're joined by four esteemed thinkers and climbers for a roundtable discussion on the meaning of climbing. But before I get ahead of myself, I want to take a second to meet today's interlocutors. So Steve, I was wondering if you can get us started by letting us know who you are and what you do.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Downs. I've been climbing a lot longer than I've been doing philosophy, but I'm currently a philosophy professor at the University of Utah. And I thought it might be worth telling everybody I turned 60 last month.
Happy birthday.
Something of an achievement. And I probably started climbing when I was around 14 or 15 years old in Merseyside area of Great Britain. And that's probably good enough to get people going. Over to you, T.
Hi, I'm Thi Nguyen. I'm also a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah. Surprising that climbing philosophers end up strangely in Utah. I think I am a really bad climber, like abysmally bad. It changed my entire relationship to my body, though, and it became a central thing. Basically, my career took this huge left turn where I abandoned all the philosophy I was supposed to do, and I became a specialist in the philosophy of art and a specialist in the philosophy of games. And I've written this whole book. Those on video can see it. Here's the book.
Yeah.
And my experience of climbing and my relationship to like discovering the possibility that my body was not just a gross thing, but could be like an elegant thing, sort of, a little bit, is like one of the central ideas in the book. Over to you, Bill.
I'm Bill Ramsey, and I'm like Steve. I've been climbing for billions of years, well, really about 45. Just recently turned 62. And in fact, Steve and our climbing careers have overlapped a fair bit, especially back in the early 90s. We climbed a lot together. But I teach philosophy at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. I've been here for about 13 years. Really love the climbing around here. And before that, I was teaching at Notre Dame, where I did a bunch of climbing at the Red River Gorge. So I feel really lucky. I've had a career where I've been able to spend time in different areas of the country and sometimes be a little bit involved in development. I started climbing at Smith Rock in the mid 70s. So I'm super psyched to have this kind of conversation. This is bringing together two things that I really love, climbing and philosophy. So I think it's really going to be fun. And Debbie then.
Hi, everyone. So my name's Debbie Halbert, and I actually am not a philosopher. I'm a political scientist, though I went to graduate school to do political theory. So there's clearly a little bit of an overlap. And then it sounds like much like UT, I took a left turn into copyright law and have mostly spent my academic career doing intellectual property work. I started climbing in the mid 80s in Washington State, where I'm from, and I learned to climb from some of the old school trad folks who despised sport climbing. And then after graduate school, I moved to Ohio. So actually, Bill, we probably overlapped a lot in the red because I spent most of my sport climbing years learning and climbing in the Red River Gorge, which is an absolutely beautiful place. And then came to Hawaii about 12 years ago. And Hawaii is not a destination for climbing, as you probably know, but we do have a small little climbing area and a really great community. And after this podcast, I will be going out there to do a little bit of climbing today.
All right, Debbie, that's awesome. So, well, first, I just want to really deeply thank you guys for all agreeing to be on this talk. 3 of the 4 of you, of course, were published in this book, Climbing, Philosophy for Everyone. And if you don't have a copy of it, you're holding it up.
In the bookshelf. Yeah.
It's a really good book. And I think everybody, if you're into climbing or philosophy, I think you'd really love this book. But I want to talk about why or how this kind of roundtable discussion came together. Not long ago, a friend of ours, a fellow rock climber named Jen Elger, who is a professor, she teaches theater. She asked about the meaning of climbing. And this to me, it kind of threw me back. At first, I'm just like, we can just talk about the definition of climbing and we're done. But I don't think that's what she meant. So I asked her, I was like, hey, can you hold that thought for a second? Maybe I can get some people who have something more to say about the meaning of climbing than I could offer. And so I reached out to these kind climbers to ask them to give them some time. And here we are. So today we're going to be spending some time talking deeply, hopefully, about the meaning of climbing, something that goes above and beyond just the definition of climbing. So, Steve, I was wondering if maybe you could start us off by sharing some of your thoughts and insights about the meaning of climbing.
Yeah, so what I thought I would do is just run through a couple of ways in which I've seen climbing give meaning to people's lives, and they come from I've given them names. You guys can quibble about the names, but I think about the process. I think about the achievements that you gain through climbing. I think about the social groups that you form through climbing. And I think about measuring achievement. And I think about something, for want of a better word, I call it the addictive aspect. And I know in my speaking autobiographically, the various of these things have been the way in which climbing contributed to my life and given it a special kind of meaning. And so I'll just pick one example. I think that I'll do the addictive aspect one, because for lots of folks, when they're first introduced to climbing, irrespective of age, there's a part of it that comes to you. A lot of folks who climb have never been good at traditional sports in their high school or college, and have come to climbing, however, a friend introduced them to it or something, and they get home from the first day of climbing and just buzzing with excitement. My arms are really tired. I don't know why. I felt like I was really scared, but at the same time, I wanted to be scared again. And there are these components to it that, for many people, it's not the gateway to it. But for a lot of people, I think that first time of going out and climbing just has a similar impact on people to the first time they do a really long run, or the first time they avoid a close shave, like narrowly miss wrecking in a car. And it's just one of these things that someone's life could have been going along, and they've never known that they were seeking that kind of excitement, and that just becomes it. You have to have it again and again and again. And I think using the term addiction is probably, it gives it a kind of bad cast, but maybe you can help me out with another term. And just to wrap up, I think that all of the achievement process, the social measuring achievement and addiction, they're all obviously interleaved. So you could start with one or other of them as the way into climbing and the way that you first started getting some meaning out of it. But certainly one of the things for me when I was a teenager was I wanted to go back because of the excitement and the thrill. And also the point I made, the confusion about never having had my forearms feel so strange before. Because, all the sports you do, I did ball sports, soccer, rugby, and I was a cross-country runner, and I never used my forearms. It didn't exist. So anyway, I'll ante up with that.
That's beautiful. T, what do you think?
This is actually, like, you've kind of described me in my experience with this. I mean, actually one time a bunch of people were sitting around and they were like, climbers, and they were like, why do we climb? And people were saying things. And I was like, well, I guess a lot of us are self-medicating depressives, and our medication is like beauty and intensity. And then like suddenly like half them went, and we're like, wait, I thought I was the only one. I mean, I have this feeling actually that a lot of people in my dad's family are like kind of like moody and they exercise a shit ton. And then I couldn't, because at least growing up, I was asthmatic, and I am asthmatic, and I was taught like, oh my God, you can't do a lot of exercise. And when I tried, like, asthmatics playing basketball is like this horror show. And I became like, like a serious board gamer, computer gamer, and one of these people that like was not just sedentary, but like violently sedentary, like completely identified with my sedentariness. Like one of these people, I'm a mind, I hate my body. And around like halfway through graduate school, my body was completely falling apart. And then I like found climbing accidentally, and I had one of the, like exactly the kind of moment Steve is talking about, where it was like, oh my God, what is this feeling in my body? And I realized I had gotten that a few other times with other things like running and that kind of stuff, but like anything that was kind of repetitive or that other people like because it's trance-like and patient, I couldn't handle. But climbing like hit the part of my brain that like computer games and board games did. I mean, to any climber, it should be like, every single bit of puzzle solving aspect, everything that where you're trying to like figure out a problem with an arrangement in your body. And that just made like, instead of like, I'd had the sense that like fitness activities had to be boring and repetitive and like being in a treadmill. And then climbing was like, oh my God, this stuff can be interesting. And then this thing happened where I had spent a lot of time being very distant from my body. And I started to like feel connected to it. And I'd spent some time doing yoga, and yoga has spent a lot of time being like, oh, feel your body. And I could kind of do it, but I have this theory that like the thing that actually broke through this wall in my head was that climbing gives you such instant feedback over whether you're being attentive to your body. Like yoga, you do the wrong thing, you do the wrong thing. Like you might not know. Climbing, if you're not paying attention to your body, the wall boots you off, and you're like, oh, shit, I let my body wander. And the next time you pay a little more attention, you get a little more sensation, and the wall's like, yeah, you got it. Come on, next step. And I think like that amount of feedback let me like discover something that like my body was nice. And then this became the centerpiece of like the like years of writing that I can talk about later. I think Debbie.
Well, it's interesting that you're talking so much about the embodied experience of climbing. And I sort of, when I was trying to categorize my thought, I did think of this in terms of the personal and what it means to me personally, but then also these forging of communities, and then the connection, of course, to the larger natural world as the sort of ways I was thinking through this. And to build off of what you've both been talking about in terms of the personal experience, and I'm guessing we can come back to a lot of the other ones. I remember the very first time I touched rock as a climber and began to think about that. And I was a horribly weak person and, had never done anything like it. And we had our harnesses made out of webbing, and we were learning how to do hip belays because this was the 80s. And it was almost immediately this moment of self-empowerment, right? And that, and as I got stronger, which of course, granted, didn't happen until I started sport climbing, it became an even more important form of self-empowerment for me. And it's hard even today, as I've, stopped being as systematic a climber, it's sort of integral to the identity I've forged of myself to have this sort of strong underlying self-empowerment that, like you said, is sort of built into the way you move in the rock. And so climbing, it's a way of almost removing your ego from what you're doing. I know we probably all had the experience where when things are going really well, it's like you're not even there, and you sort of transcend some of the problems of whatever your everyday life are. So that is sort of, I think, a critical part of what climbing has always been for me. But then there's the other part about it where you confront fear in a way that then actually translates outside of climbing, because you have to master your fear and you have to sort of subsume that under whatever it is you're doing. And we've all had the experience where that doesn't happen, and then you suffer some sort of climbing blindness and can't even see the giant hold right in front of your face. Or we have the opposite experience where things just flow, and to me that taps into, I guess, what I would consider to be the sublime, right? So there's this reaching out into something that transcends your individual place in this world. And again, that maybe connects to nature a little bit as well, because of course the sublime is that connection to nature. And I'm sure we all have stories of that moment of experience. I certainly know I do. So that's at the personal level for me, potentially over theorized, but anyway, that's kind of how I think about climbing. Bill, I'll hand it over to you and come back to some of the other thoughts.
Right. Well, good. Thanks. I mean, I'm just going to build on those comments. Steve knows my dissertation advisor would always say, be very clear on the question that's being asked. And so when I think about the question, what is the meaning in climbing? When I think about meaning, I work on representation. Well, the things that have meaning are words and sentences and, road signs and stuff like that. And how does an activity have meaning? And I sometimes feel the same way when as a philosopher, I'm sure we've all been asked, well, what's the meaning of life, right? And I think, I don't really understand that question. I think a way to translate it, I need to translate it is, well, where's the meaning in life, right? How do you get meaning out of life? What do you find valuable in life? And I feel the same way about the question, what's the meaning of climbing? What is the meaning in climbing? Where do we find value in climbing? How do we find it enriching and fulfilling and rewarding? And then when I sort of think of the question in that way, what is it about climbing that enriches our lives? Then it becomes a very easy question to answer, it seems to me. And it's exactly the kinds of things that you folks were talking about, right? It's the striving, the self-empowerment, the overcoming both physical and psychological hardship and difficulty. And it's getting to do this in this incredibly beautiful environment. The aesthetics of the outdoor area is just so stunning. And it's also, even though there's a tremendous amount of self-reliance in this activity where you really got to depend upon yourself, there's also these bonds that you form with other people. And, when I'm climbing and I'm taking falls on a regular basis, it's literally the case that with my partner, we're literally saving each other's lives 2 or 3 times that day. So you form these really, really tight bonds. And just personally, in my own case, I really came to appreciate this. I started climbing at Smith in the mid 70s. And just like Steve said, I was very much addicted. It was like a drug. I was obsessed with climbing. But then as I went into college and started studying philosophy and realized that I kind of had to devote some time and energy to academia, I had to get away from it. I took a job at Notre Dame. It's the flatlands, it's the cornfields, but I really missed it. And I came to appreciate these dimensions of climbing that provide so much value in my life. I came to appreciate that actually with a trip I took with Steve to the New River Gorge. I think it was in 90 or 91 or something like that. And all those dimensions that I just mentioned, the striving, the trying to overcome hardship in various ways, and then finding that incredibly fulfilling, and being in a really stunningly beautiful area that I didn't know existed in West Virginia. And then also hanging out with a group of people, a community where they're just as really interesting characters, and forming good friendships in that way. I realized that I needed to get back into it. And so it's this way in which I think climbing gives our lives meaning. And I think sort of maybe one thing we can talk about later that I want to sort of think about is, insofar as climbing has these distinctive ways in which they enhance our lives. It's interesting to ask, well, is there something distinct about climbing? Is there a unique set of ethos or norms that are associated with climbing that you don't get in other dimensions of life, that you don't get in other areas? And is this something that we should be concerned about? Is this something we should be aware of in various ways? In other words, is there a distinct culture to climbing? And is that culture part of what provides this enhanced, fulfilling, and rewarding activity for us? And I think the answer probably is yes.
Yeah, I'll try to stay out of it as much as possible. I love listening to you guys, but I don't know if you remember the song "Ladies' Night" from the early 2000s with Missy Elliott, who she's singing the hook of this song, and then at the end of the song she's like, I'm not gonna let you guys say everything, I've got something to say too, so I'll just pop on for a second. And then Bill, I really think it's an interesting question. I'd love to come back to it, but in listening, it seems like there's not an answer. What is the meaning of climbing? It's almost as if we all bring our own meanings, or we discover meaning within climbing that works for us. And I think it's okay. And I think it's true that I might have a meaning of climbing on Tuesday that might be different on a Wednesday, right? Sometimes it's just to get out aggression, or sometimes it's just to calm me down or focus. Those are all really good reasons. I love the idea of the sublime. But I'm wondering if, I mean, it seems like there is some overlap. I wonder if there's like a normal distribution of people's meanings for climbing, where there might be something on the fringes that would escape even what Bill was talking about. That's like not part of the culture of climbing. Like if somebody comes into climbing, and they're just like, I'm very competitive. I'm gonna beat all of you. I'm gonna climb higher grades. That doesn't seem to go along with what I think of as climbing. And that might be somebody's meaning, and not to say it's wrong, but it's certainly outside of what we typically think of climbing as. And so, Bill, I was wondering if we can maybe come back to your question and talk about things that are not part of the climbing
Right.
dynamic.
Well, I mean, I think part of what I find with climbing is that climbers tend to be intellectuals, quite frankly. They tend to be really smart people. They love the problem solving process, and they tend to be pretty generous people. I mean, Debbie's essay in that book about how climbing is a kind of gift economy where people put tremendous amount of time and energy into developing a route and money, and that's just a gift to the community. They don't own the climb after that. I think that's a beautiful essay, and it's a nice example of where I think there are norms and ethos that you find in climbing that you don't find elsewhere, that you don't find in mainstream society. I think another one is a kind of acceptance of risk. You know, I mean, in most things we do in our life, it's safety is everything. But there is this, kind of libertarian activity we do called climbing, where risk isn't completely avoided at all times. And in fact, it's sometimes embraced as a critical dimension of this thing that we're doing. And the reason why I've been thinking about this is I realize increasingly, with not just the influx of people getting into climbing, but I think climbing may be the only activity now where the only outdoor activity where the overwhelming majority of people who are getting into it begin in an artificial environment. Right. I can't think of any, it's not the case. Most skiers learn to ski on a ski. It's not the case that most skiers are learning to ski in an indoor artificial environment. And so I sometimes worry that there is this aspect of climbing that's uniquely distinctive, this distinct set of values, this distinct set of ethos. And what's nice about it, if you believe in diversity, it's nice to have activities where there's a diverse set of values. And one concern I sometimes have is the gentrification of a kind of unique and distinctive culture by people who just aren't aware of that or aren't familiar with that. And I think that's especially in danger in climbing because so many people learn to climb in this very artificial environment now, and then come into climbing from this artificial environment without really knowing a lot about the historical background of climbing and the degree to which climbing is different from other activities. And so that's just something that I've been thinking about lately. And I'd be curious what other people have to say about that, what the other three of you have to say.
I had a follow-up to that, because one of the things I was really trying to do when I was thinking of addressing this question is that I would try and figure out why it was that other people saw meaning in climbing. And it could be a generational thing. And just keying off the thing that you said, Bill, about the folks coming into climbing through the climbing gym. So that the vast majority of people climbing now started climbing in a gym. And
right.
This makes me think that when I ran through my list of ways in which it gives people meaning, I think that there are thousands, if more than thousands maybe, of people out there who are finding meaning in climbing through things that through ways that they find meaning in other kinds of things. And that's the part that I call the achievement measurement. So it's I interact with my climbing friends at the gym or through social media, and I can project myself as a member of this group, the climbers, and I do it in the way that my peers do it about all of our activities. So in that way, it's no different than skateboarding or snowboarding or any of the other things that we do. And the thing I worry about when Bill says that he thinks there might be a culture or a kind of core set of values to climbing, I think that that's probably a very temporally local, or the kind of way in which we came into it is why we think that those things are the core values. And I'll just give you one example of a clash of these values that happened recently. It was there was a big Instagram outburst about it a few months ago. Sam Elias, who's a Salt Lake local climber, came upon some of his friends bouldering at either Joe's Valley or Triassic, and a group came in and basically kicked his friends off the problem and said very unpleasant things, demeaned his friends' efforts out on the problem, and said, "We won't take long, we're just warming up," and turned their speakers up really loudly. And the Instagram discussion was basically that Sam and his friends were right, and these people were horrid, mean, evil people, until someone came on the Instagram feed and said, "That was you guys, right?" and tagged them. And I got a sense that some folks get different things out of climbing, and it fits with their group of values. And I mean, what I saw when I was very young, and I've seen it a lot in climbing, is I think these folks, the ones that Sam's alleging are the bad guys, they get the meaning through the competitive aspect, the burning people off, that kind of edge, and that's where they get it from. And I think that you can say, well, that's really shitty and it's not part of climbing, but I don't think that any of us who've been involved in the history of climbing as long as this collective group has is going to say that climbing doesn't have a competitive element, doesn't have folks who get their meaning out of it through achievement, burning people off, clipping the chains, getting to the top, et cetera, and just an example where Bill might try and come back and say, no, I mean the core values, and these things can kind of leak in. But I think that actually, that's just my main point. People come to it from different social groups. They get drawn into it for different reasons, and that's the meaning they see in it. And we can have these clashes of the way people see meanings that are spelled out in the incident that Sam talked about. And I
can I just respond?
What's that?
You're absolutely right. I mean, if there's one also core value that is unique, well, not unique to climbing, but it's certainly been there. It's the younger people coming in and changing things,
burning up the old people.
Obviously, I was a part of that myself, with Smith Rock and everything. But of course, there's a but. I do believe that throughout that, there have been some values that have been pretty stationary and not very flexible. And I think one of them, for example, is a very strong respect for the environment, and a very strong commitment to an ethos that takes into consideration environmentalism, takes into consideration the natural setting and things like that. And I think that you can go back, to John Muir all the way through, even sport climbers at Smith Rock and boulders and whatnot. That's been a pretty consistent core value. And so I definitely do think that there's various ways in which new generations come along, people come in with their own meaning, their own conception of what really matters. And there's always been exactly the kind of clash you're talking about has always been there. I mean, go back to the 80s and look at the folks and how they behaved then. It's just constantly trying to burn each other off in various ways. So that I don't want to pretend that hasn't gone on. And I'm not even sure that there's much coming into climbing from the outside that I don't like. I think many of these young people, they're just awesome. They're great people. But I do wonder, I think it's worth wondering. Let me put it to you this way. Is it acceptable for people who are having difficulties with what's happening in climbing? Is it ever acceptable to say the following? Well, then maybe climbing's not right for you. So that's I think is an interesting question. Is that ever an acceptable thing to say? I'm inclined to think yes. I think I'm inclined to say this is distinctive, this is unique. And so maybe insofar as you don't like this aspect of it, then maybe climbing's not right for you. But I can see somebody saying that's never an acceptable thing to say. So that's kind of where this is coming from a little bit. But I should shut up. I've been talking too much.
So I think one of the, when I think about this question of like, is climbing right for you? Or like, are you doing it the right way? Um, I think, so my way of thinking about climbing is that climbing is a game. And one of the key features of games is that the local goal and the overall purpose are different, right? Like in a game, you're trying to win, but the reason you're trying to win, some people want to win because they win, but some people want to win because it's fun or because it'll be funny or because it'll give them exercise or it'll be absorbing or it'll relax them. And I think actually an interesting thing is a lot of the times we don't, we aren't even fully aware of the purpose or meaningfulness an activity is giving us. We're chasing this goal and we're getting these goods, but the goods leak into us without our attending to them. So easy example. So I went, before I was into climbing, I was into fishing. I was bad at fishing. I couldn't catch any fish. Like it was really annoying. And I couldn't figure out why I kept wanting to go back to fishing. And I realized it's because I was in graduate school. And when I went fishing, I stared at a body of water for 5 hours. And like the thing that just doing that did to my mind was like extraordinary. It brought like peace and calm, but I didn't even realize it for a long time. I think with climbing, at some point I realized that climbing basically saved my sanity in graduate school. Um, and I'm one of the generation that started in the gym and and then we started going outdoors after a while. And then all of a sudden we realized that doing the outdoor climbing thing made us like profoundly happy. And at like years later, I look back and I realized, I think the reason is that it made us like go on road trips every weekend. And the actual act of leaving our little like crappy LA apartment, putting our books away, like going out and then being out there and being like exhausted and unmoving in nature. My wife, by the way, who I got into climbing, said she had no idea that the hardest thing that you could do with your body also just involved lying around drinking beer for half the day outside and just like giving each other shit. And like there's this rhythm that you fall into. And I think a lot of people like they start climbing and they get happier. And for a lot of us, we don't realize for a long time why we're happier. We just know that we're happier. And I think sometimes it's easy to think, oh, I'm happier because I'm doing better, I'm winning. And you don't realize it's these other things. So one thought, and I think this is actually a little thought on the bill column of things, is that there's a structure and a rhythm to outdoor climbing and certain opportunities for outdoor climbing. And if you start in a gym, they're easy to miss, but there are opportunities in the activity. And it's really good. I mean, I think one way to say it is if all you want is higher numbers, you could just lift in your basement, right? Like there's something, climbing offers you something else. And I don't want to say that, oh, you're doing it wrong, but I want to say something like, look,
Yeah,
maybe you're
exactly.
missing something. And maybe if the thing that's in the outdoors is not the thing you care about, maybe just stay in the gym. Like I actually think there's plenty of people who try the outside. They're like, whatever. It's a lot of effort. I just like I just want to get ripped. I'll just stay in the gym. That's fine too. But I think there's something you asked like what's special about climbing. There are a lot of things. There's the ethics, there's the nature, but I think there's something about intense attention to features of the natural world that create attunement. Like I have never looked at a rock as fucking closely as I do when I'm searching like a Joshua tree slab for like that little foot, right? And I mean, this maybe this it's up. I
You
did.
try it for
You have
multiple
no
seasons.
idea how many slabs I failed at for like 8 years of graduate school in Joshua Tree. Well, maybe you do. You probably do, actually. People listening to this probably do. But this is probably the philosophy of art side of me. But I think like there's a special frame of attention that a lot of us don't have in normal life. Like, so the idea in aesthetics is in normal life, you're just like looking at the world and you're only looking at certain things. In aesthetic life, you kind of open yourself and you see more. And climbing has this weird thing where you do both. You get like super practical, but about something you normally aren't practical about, tiny features of the rock. And then you step back and you're like, okay, I've climbed the thing and now I'm in nature and now I have a beer and now I'm lying down. But also my entire mood has been hypersensitized to natural details. And I've like never had more intense experiences of seeing nature than in and around climbing. And that's one of those things where you're like, that's an opportunity. That's not something that gyms normally give you. And if you're there, maybe take advantage of that opportunity, because that's special. That's not something that a lot of other things give you.
Wanted to come back a little to this way in which we're defining community and who's in it and who's out of it and how we identify with it, because I think it's super interesting to me because of the way we all engage personally with climbing, but the community itself seems to be constantly undergoing this sort of self-defining that pushes boundaries, because the other part of it, and what makes it hard to figure out how you shape the community, is every sort of new evolution of climbing is pushing boundaries in different kinds of ways. And so, like I said, I learned to climb from a bunch of old school mountaineers who hated sport climbers and thought that hang dogging was just this despicable act, and that if you couldn't climb something clean, then you came down and you started over. You didn't just like hang on the rock, right? And so I saw the shift though, right? Because I lived through that shift. And then you think about other shifts that have happened within a community. But these are, and it sounds, Steve, like one of the ones you're talking about, where there's these sort of intense moments where you have to start, you have the conversation about what the community as a whole means. Some people may embrace that and some people may not. And then it ends up being this conversation, because again, we're sort of making it up as we go along, right? It's not like these rules were set in stone on tablets decreed by God. These are things we have created ourselves to help define the scope of what has meaning to us. But within it itself, and this is, I think, to your point, T, I mean, I never started projecting until I came to Hawaii, and there's only 50 routes. So eventually you're going to have to try to do all of them. And you know, these things move from just being impossible to you, right? It's like, I can't physically understand how I'm ever going to do this, to, okay, maybe I can kind of get it. Okay, it's maybe doable now. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, yeah, I got this. And then it's done. And so that, I think, from the personal level of impossibility to completion, is similar to how the community as a whole keeps pushing its boundaries. So it's never a static thing. We're always in this moment of evolution towards whatever's next. And the gym climbers are just bringing this other part in. And as some, you know, an older climber, I get all curmudgeonly about it too. But at least in Hawaii, we also have a sort of ethic where if someone seems to has come out of a gym and doesn't really know how to belay right, or we just had someone show up with a static rope the other day, and it's like, nah, this is how it works, right? You know, so we try to take care of each other as well, but not in a way that would be over, well, hopefully not in a way that's too demanding or kicking people off of routes, as your example was.
I just thought of something that might tie together everything that the three of you have said, and it might hit at one of those kind of core values that Bill was talking about, and bring a little bit of the aesthetic understanding to it. So I would bet that everyone in this, it's not a room. What are these things we're in?
Is it a virtual room, maybe? A virtual
room. Everyone around the table really enjoys watching people climb well. And it's something that I think that we, I find it really hard to understand if I come across someone who identifies as a climber and I'm with them watching someone climb and I'm overwhelmed at how well this person's climbing and they're just indifferent. And I think that's about as close as I come to Bill's point about, I don't think this is for you, because that's the big violation for me. It's like, really? You're a climber and you don't appreciate what she just did? And it's not that she got to the top, it's the way it was done. You're just transfixed, just like, I've just experienced amazing rock climbing happening. And that's one of the reasons I do it. Is I want to feel like that myself every now and again, but I also like being around it and I want to be around it. And if somebody says, yeah, I'm really into climbing, but yeah, you know, that doesn't do it for me, then I'm puzzled. I'm really puzzled.
I want to make one clarification, because I just realized that it's pretty easy to misinterpret what I was saying. right now we're in a phase where there's a lot of focus on inclusivity in climbing, and I think that's a good thing. Without a doubt, it's been predominantly white males for a long time, and I think no one should ever feel unwelcome in climbing, going to the cliff because of their ethnicity or gender or anything like that at all. What I was really referring to was I've actually had this happen where someone comes to the cliff and they say, what kind of licensing do you go through to be able to do this? And they say, no, there's no licensing. Young people can come here and they have that liberty, that freedom to make dumb mistakes. That's one of the things that I think we find very valuable, that kind of freedom to screw things up. I couldn't believe it when I was starting out at 15, 16. I was like, oh, wow, I'm in a really dangerous situation, but I have empowerment through that freedom. And so what I'm talking about, somebody comes along and says, we need to change this in climbing. Climbing needs to have licensing. You need to be registered. It needs to be more like scuba diving because it's, so someone coming in with that kind of paternalistic attitude, that's what I'm saying, where maybe someone with that attitude, maybe climbing's not right for them. And that's what I meant basically in terms of people who see something that we value a great deal in climbing, even though it's very counterculture, and say, that needs to change. I don't like that about climbing. That needs to undergo a transformation. I think in those cases, sometimes at least, some things do need to change in climbing. And we've been at this discussion of route names, and some of those route names are truly horrible. But I do think there are other ways in which I've encountered people who think, you guys shouldn't be allowed to do this, with the liberty and freedom that you have. And it's those kinds of people where I think, well, you need to understand that climbing's different. It is different in some ways. And that's what I was really referring to. But I certainly 100% agree with all three of you. I'm in the gym much of the time, and I love the gyms. I think that's a great thing. But I do believe that old farts like me need to do more, and as much as we can, to help those people who are going to be leaving the gym when they come to the cliff to know what's going on and how that works. And not simply just in terms of safety, but in terms of courtesy and the different sorts of values that exist at the cliff and how to appreciate the environment, all sorts of things. I do a PowerPoint presentation at the local gyms that's on this kind of thing. And I think gyms should be doing more of this as well. I really do believe that gyms need to kind of step up a little bit and recognize that they're social citizens, and they kind of need to be helping us in this regard with regard to preparing people for climbing outdoors and just other aspects of climbing too.
Yeah, I was trying to can I get philosophical for a second?
Absolutely not.
Go one level
Away.
Weird.
No, it's not allowed.
I was thinking about both this sense of the openness to newness, to what new styles are bringing in, and also the sense that no, you might be missing something. There are right ways to do this, and I've been thinking about. So I don't know if you've read this, but there's this book I've been in love with, philosophy book, The Retrieval of Ethics by Tal Brewer, and he thinks that a lot of the times we make this mistake that when we come to an activity, we know ahead of time what it's for. We know that the good is to make this thing. And he thinks a lot of the times there's this, he calls it this dialectical account of value. We try something and doing it gives us kind of a sense of what its value could be. And then we change it a little bit in order to get that value better. And then that shows us something more about its opportunities. And I was really thinking about what Debbie was saying about how this is the evolution of communities of doing things differently. And I sometimes think maybe this is, again, my background is thinking about this in terms of games, but when I look at the history of climbing, it looks to me a lot like a history of a game design, where you experiment, you change a rule, and sometimes that makes the activity worse, and sometimes that makes the activity better. I always explain something so a lot of people who are outside of climbing are what's this weird rule you have that you can't pull on the gear? Why not, for us, why not do aid climbing? And my answer is it turns out, from what I can tell, if you do aid climbing, then you get a more repetitive activity. But when you introduce this new rule, don't touch the gear, then the activity becomes much more variable. And that's an experiment. That's a game design choice, and it comes out better. And so I think what you get is this push-pull where, yeah, people who've been doing it for a long time actually have a really strong sense of its value and a strong sense of why certain norms that you might not get at first turn out to be really, really valuable and lead to this rich thing. On the other hand, climbing's a really new fucking game. And like a lot of the times, like someone will pull off an experiment something like, oh, maybe you should try, maybe hang dogging should be okay. And then you do it and it opens up this new venue. And like, this is one of the, okay, maybe this is too, whatever. So one of the nuttier things I have in my games book is Mill, you know, the utilitarian guy, Mill, thought that we needed these things called experiments in living, where you try on different communities, you try to act under different conceptions of the good. He was talking about like utopian communities. And I've always thought that games kind of do that. You like kind of experiment with different ways of being. And I kind of think maybe one way to do this, I mean, this is what's happening, is that different climber communities are like running different experiments about slightly different game designs. And a lot of the times, I think norms that change from one area to the other area, they actually make sense when you understand something really specific about the area. Like there's some areas where like it's like, no, boulders only start with your butt on the ground, and then you go to some areas that's not there, and you realize, oh, it's just like structurally, like they're just like I was actually in an area where people didn't seem to have this rule, and the reason seemed to be that like just something about the rock, all the right holds were like just a little too high for that kind of sit start for shorter people. So you change the norms a little bit, right? So I mean, I don't know what I'm saying, except that there's this weird thing in which it may be that at the same time, people who have been in the game for a long time know exactly this rich set of norms that newcomers don't. On the other hand, there are innovations that can like change the practice. And if you're like, no, don't do it that way, you'll miss like new flourishings of the practice. Sorry, was that too philosophical?
No. So I wanted to add something, because I think that you can, we've been around long enough to see when people started getting much better at overhanging climbing, there were a whole new bunch of repertoires that were introduced that were physical. And you just thought, I never thought of doing that. I didn't climb side onto the rock for probably 20 years, from like 1974 to, yeah, probably nearly 20 years. And people started doing that. And so that's it, like introducing a new style of body movement that opens up all of these opportunities in the way that Thi's saying. But it's not introducing a norm. It's introducing this way of addressing the whole thing.
No, you have to have 3 points of contact on the rock at all times.
Yeah, I mean that when people started to get good at overhanging climbing, it was by breaking away from those overt norms or instructions about how it's supposed to be done. And I don't just mean campusing, I mean twisting sideways. That was just mind blowing when people started doing that. Yeah, norm violation for progress.
Yeah. We have a specific way in Hawaii that I've never seen anywhere else in the world, our string system, which really allows any of the climbs to be top rope. So you don't have to lead in Hawaii. I mean, it evolved for a couple of reasons. One is we absolutely don't want people generally to go to the top of the cliff to set a top rope, because that it's just not stable and lots of things can fall. We don't have a local climbing gym. We have a bouldering gym, but not a climbing gym. So nobody can learn inside here. And so you get a lot of folks going out that don't know how to lead. You know, and you get these problems elsewhere. The way Hawaii solved it, and this existed before I moved here, was we have strings on every single anchor. And so you can just set up a top rope. But we get people coming in from the mainland and they're like, this is an abomination. And they pull all the strings down. One of those where you're like, wait a second, this is our local way of doing things that we've set up for these reasons. Anyway.
It's genius as well.
I
mean, the horror of seeing people walking around on the top of the cliff trying to set up top ropes, the strings.
Yeah.
Why didn't everybody else think of that?
So we have strings. But I did want to also, Bill, to your point about the sort of way in which we're in this, and that it's sort of this libertarian haven, which I agree, I embrace, and I love that that's a part of the sport. But because I'm a political scientist, I would be remiss not to say that we also are bound by the state and the rules it is increasingly imposing on us. And that to me is my fear for the future of climbing, because for example, in Hawaii, we are obligated to have everyone that comes to our cliffs sign a waiver because the state has forced us to do this. And if we don't, they'll revoke the permit they gave us to access the cliff line. So, I mean, I don't want to get into the politics of climbing in Hawaii, which are immense, but I see, obviously the access fund exists for a reason. So as much as I want to live in this space that we've created for ourselves, and as much as it's personally liberatory, we still are bound by these structures that I fear will ultimately also disrupt what we do.
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, that's a good segue into something that I think is another norm of climbing, which is we do have to be organized to protect our sport and our activity and this way of living. And it's true, there are forces in government that we're often having to go up against. I mean, locally here, BLM, they work with us very closely. They're a very good organization. We've been very fortunate to be able to work closely with them with our local access group. But there are, they're just the numbers. It's just the sheer numbers is an issue. And they're seeing this happen and they're wanting to impose restrictions. There's now a reservation system out at Red Rock. And so it's a constant concern that we all have, which is why I think, another plug I want to make is everybody should get involved with their local access group. Almost all areas have a affiliate of the Access Fund. And, it's very important to be involved and to be engaged and to, participate in things like cleanup days and show that you're good stewards of the land, because I do believe that's been a traditional ethic of climbing is, when you talk to land managers like BLM and Forest Service, they're like, well, actually climbers are really good. They, compared to other outdoor recreation people, climbers are really, really beneficial. They do a lot to help the area. And so I want to maintain that good relationship with them, because you're absolutely right. The amount of freedom we're going to have to climb is dependent upon the decisions that people in government are making. So that's, I think, a universal value. We need to band together and work for things like access and work with land managers to preserve what we have.
But the libertarian freedom streak of climbing comes into clash, as Debbie points out, through the state regulations, but also within the climbing community. So we have the flooding of a new climbing area and people putting up new routes in it, and then everybody finds out it's in a wilderness study area. And those are times when Bill's point about climbers thinking that they're good stewards of the environment, lots of times we get a bit ahead of ourselves and or confused on these issues, because just all of the things that make us want to climb the finding a new cliff that nobody's been to, nobody's bolted, and it appears to be perfect limestone, and it's got routes starting from 510 going up to possibly 515, and you're just like, we're in, let's go, this is the dream. And all those thoughts about your local climbing organization and the Forest Service and the BLM, they usually come second, because you've just been looking at this untapped stone and thinking, this is it, we have found it. And we've seen lots of areas shut down, we've seen fights between people. It's a constant struggle.
Absolutely. I was involved in the development of a cliff at the Red River Gorge that then subsequently had to be entirely erased. And so yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
But also, like, Bill, there's this like this beautiful memory of like a perfectly libertarian climbing community, but it's easy to be libertarian when the numbers are small and the supply of goods, it vastly outstrips the numbers.
Yep.
But flip that stuff, and I don't know, like I don't know if it's possible to do that again with the scale.
Yeah, I that's why I wanted to bring it up, frankly, because I think you're absolutely right about that. I think that there were certain luxuries that we had in the 70s and 80s when you go out to Smith Rock and there's two other climbing parties there, there were certain luxuries that we had that we don't have anymore just because of the sheer numbers of people getting into it. And so I think we do have to rethink these sorts of things. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation, actually.
I do think at the same time, like, I mean, I feel like I'm definitely like from the generation that a lot of you're worried about. Like, I'm part of the people that started in the gym and came flooding in.
It's
and,
your fault. You're the problem.
It's my fault.
See?
But the reason I think is, I mean, I think there are these like two complex. I don't quite know why, but they seem to happen right after each other. There's a long time where people thought like food was this canned crap, and then they went to like, oh, food has to be like super nutritious and flavorless. And there's this discovery by a lot of people that no, this can be really rich and good. I think like something similar happened, and my sedentary hatred of exercise came out of the conception of what fitness and exercise was supposed to be. Like when I grew up, it was like it's either running on a treadmill or, you know, bodybuilding, and those are the only options. And there's this very little conception or of like that something there could be this profoundly interesting, like aesthetically interesting, intellectually involving, communally rich thing that was just like not on the radar. And I think now more and more it's like so the various things like climbing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, like all the functional movement people, parkour. I'm like currently, I can't climb right now because it's like disgusting in winter and COVID's keeping me out of the climbing gyms. So I'm doing this like crazy program by some parkour people where you learn to like run around like an animal and roll and tumble on the ground. And like, I think this thing is starting, and I can definitely feel that for one generation of climbers, it's like, it's kind of cool, but why are there so many people that out here? And for someone like me, it's like, I feel like for a lot of people, we had this idea that exercise had to be this like penitential, crappy thing. And then we discovered there was this other thing, and now that the discovery is spreading, and now there are these people that have been like, you know, raised like the equivalent of raised on crappy worst canned food, discovering, oh my god, this is what real food, this is what real movement feels like, this is what it's like to love your body. And now they're like flooding in, and I see like so many, I mean, it's really interesting in academia watching this, because I think the generation of people that trained me, most of them hated exercise, life of the mind. And now, like, I feel like my generation, all of them are like, of course, it's interesting, right? The discovery that it's interesting, like, spreads like a fire across people. And, like, that's, I think, part of what you're seeing.
Oh, without a doubt, without a doubt. I mean, I don't want to begrudge anybody who gets into climbing now. They're discovering something that we all love. And so it's perfectly natural and understandable. There's no question about it. I think you see the same thing happening in other activities as well. I think it's true about surfing. I think you know, sure, Steve, and you guys can tell about snowboarding and what the hills are like these days. We had this kind of, in many ways, 40 years ago, we had this nice little secret. There's this awesome activity, and we were more than happy to bring other people into it, but we never saw, you know, where now it's thousands of people. But I completely get it. I completely understand it. And there's no, and in many ways, I'm thrilled to see them have the kind of enjoyment that we have. I'm thrilled to see that. But I do believe it poses some challenges that our generation and future generations are going to have to come to terms with.
And I do want to highlight.
Well, sorry, Debbie.
The value of being a dirtbag, that I think there's a subversive component to climbing, even if you start in a gym, and you can see that evolution, right? And I think you sort of spoke to it, where you might start as a normal person and you go to shopping malls and you buy all this crap, and then you aspire literally to give up everything and live in a van and only climb and hang out at campfires and drink beer with your friends and meet all these amazing people. And to me, that is a subversive kind of way of undermining a lot of what I think is problematic with our very materialistic culture. And that is something you want everyone to be able to experience, even though maybe we don't need everyone to live in vans and hang out at campgrounds. But that is, to watch people be able to see that way of life, I think is a super exciting part about what climbing brings as well.
I think that's exactly right, but it's also something that us old curmudgeons have a way of resisting as well, because I I I I feel myself thinking, no, you guys aren't living the vagabond life. You've commodified it. you you've turned it into a hashtag, and that wasn't what I was doing. And I shouldn't be thinking that, because I should be thinking exactly what Bill and Debbie have been saying. It's great that people are finding this, but I'm also straining not to say, no, you haven't found it. You found the commodified hashtag version of it. And yeah, that's a confession, I guess. It upsets me. But I do think that the pure numbers thing, which is one of the things we're talking about, is it impacts things in so many different ways, because you can that sets up the socializing for people and the way in which people access their meaning in climbing. So if no one's ever been to a cliff that's completely deserted and empty, they actually come to climbing at, say Maple this summer, and they actually, loads of people really enjoy that. So the whole thing for them is this place that's full of all the kinds of colorful different climbing folks who bring character to it. And they might find it really puzzling if you said, yeah, I like Maple when I was the only person here. And they'd be like, but that's not my experience. I get everything. This is it for me. And it's the same for the Red River Gorge, same for Rifle, same for so many of these climbing areas that some of us think we're lucky enough to have experienced without any people there. But I kind of spare a thought for the folks who think, wow, you're weird if you think that's good. This is what I do it for. It's this vibrant scene of lots of climbers in this outdoor space, and that's why I go. And yeah, me or Bill or Debbie tell you, oh no, it was much better when nobody was here. They just go, how? How could it possibly be? Right? I mean, there are definitely, that's just my point about what you bring to find the meaning and the context in which you find it. And if you have only ever been to crowded cliffs, there's a lot to crowded cliffs. There's a lot that I might not like, but there's a lot that other people might think, this is climbing. I can see it all going on in front of my eyes today at Maple. Well, last fall at Maple.
We're coming up on an hour now, and I was wondering if we could kind of move to conclude the talk with one more question that I was wondering I could throw out to each of you, and that's whether or not you think something like a conversation amongst 4 or 5 academics about climbing is something that's important. Like, is this worthwhile to people beyond us and the people who will listen to this? So, Debbie, I was wondering maybe you could start us off with that.
I think you could ask that question about anything academic. When I told friends of mine that I was going to do this and it was on the meaning of climbing, there was a pause, and then there was a moment where they're like, I guess we'd never really thought about that before. So as with most of what I do as an academic, even though right now I'm on the dark side and doing administration, but when I got to teach, I think that for me, the goal is always to have folks think of things that they hadn't thought of before, right? To evoke a new way of thinking of things, so to see something differently. And so I would hope that a conversation like this could spark that for somebody and put them in a different direction than maybe they would have otherwise gone. That's about all I can hope for.
Let me put on my philosopher of art hat for a moment. One of the reasons I do aesthetics is because I think like art criticism and talking about things can like reveal a new way of valuing or bringing into starker clarity the kind of value that you always had in something, but you didn't really see it. I just like took my students through one of my favorite papers on like the aesthetics of Japanese packaging and how it's supposed to be like this slow unveiling, and like they came back and they're like, oh my God, I just opened some shit and it was like it was always there, but I hadn't noticed it. And in general, the stuff I've been doing about games, for me, like people, when they want to talk about the beauty of games, they always want to talk about like, oh, the ways in which it's like fine art, like, oh, there are cool graphics or there's good dialogue. But I always want to be like, no, games are about the beauty it brings out in your own actions. And I think sometimes just if you found something like this, I came to see the beauty in actions in my actions of climbing by listening to other people. When I was first out there, I was like, I'm gonna get fit and climb up this fucking climb. And one of my friends was like, no, dude, savor your movement. Do this. Just let it feel good. And I was like, oh yeah, that feels amazing. And so like I think the philosophy of arts part of me has like a great hope that like you can, if if the value is to be found in like moments of grace and personal attention, you can help people find it by talking. And I can like tell people about the way, how long it took me to find it, and maybe someone else can find it that way too.
That's great. Steve, what do you think?
About so yeah, I think that I've had a great time chatting to you folks, and I often think that over my philosophical career, I've tended to just stick to the philosophy. And if I'm teaching a class, and in Utah, Salt Lake, I'm teaching classes all the time, and it's either climbing season or mountain biking season or snowboarding season. And I always bring stuff into class about this, but I've always had this kind of compartmentalization in my life where I'm talking to the students about climbing, and then we're going to do some philosophy. And it's actually T showing up on the faculty. Well, before he showed up, I was aware of what he was up to. I've seen him around, and I got a lot more relaxed about thinking that when I'm talking about climbing, like in contexts like this or in the classroom, I'm doing the philosophy as well. And I used to be, as I said, much more compartmentalized. And if people said, you're a philosopher and you climb, what's the philosophy of climbing? I'd be super resistant to it. And if you'd have, Tim, if you'd have asked me to do this, 10 years ago, I'd have probably gone, I don't know, I don't so much do the philosophy of climbing. And now I'm kind of much more comfortable with the idea that, if there's an opportunity to talk about these things, I'm going to try and steer people towards thinking of them in light of some of the stuff I've learned from doing philosophy. It doesn't come from aesthetics. For me, it's mostly decision theory, heuristics and biases. Those kinds of things have informed some of my thinking. And the political stuff that, political science components that Debbie's been talking about, I've long thought of it in those terms, and the environmentalism. And I suppose this opportunity has given me a chance to think, yeah, I should do more of this. And I don't know if it's going to do any good or if it's going to reach a lot of people, but I just feel as if I should do more of it. I should take the opportunity and try and help people think through these things.
Perfect. Bill, what do you think?
I mean, well, there's this super famous quote from Plato, right? Or Socrates, really, that the unexamined life is not worth living. And you could probably say the same about climbing, right? The unexamined climbing life is not worth having. And sometimes you hear people say things like, well, you're over intellectualizing things, or you're thinking about it too much. You should just do it. That's what you really should do. But to me, thinking about it is part of the doing, right? And I think that's true of most climbers. I think climbers tend to be very self-reflective. They tend to be fairly insightful, thoughtful people. And so they do a lot of this. Why am I doing this? Why am I struggling on this project? Why am I continually following? What's my next goals? And what am I getting out of this? I think that's a process that the vast majority of climbers go through. Because as I say, I think climbers tend to be pretty thoughtful people. Now, I would hope that, one thing that's interesting is what philosophers are experts at is common sense in a way, right? And they're taking the common out of the sense, and they're trying to add some conceptual skills and some argumentative skills and some maybe reflective skills that ordinary people don't have. But most people don't recognize that. They think, well, I'm as good as it gets when it comes to just thinking something through, or when it comes to just common sense, I'm as good as it gets. But the reality is we know that there are some abilities and some advantages to having a career in philosophy where you can understand things and analyze things and reflect upon things in a way that maybe many people can't. And so I would just like to say that the people that enjoy these kinds of issues and think about these kinds of issues, you know, that we do have something to offer. I mean, if you read Debbie's essay on how climbing is a kind of gift economy, that's really helpful. That, I mean, I can guarantee you there are a lot of people developing cliffs who will read that and think, oh, yes, that actually now puts this into perspective. Or Steve's essay on how we think we understand ourselves and we think we understand our deeper motivations, but to some degree we're blind quite often, and we come up with narratives that aren't always completely accurate. Or T's analysis of climbing as a kind of game development, and that there are different experiments going on with different types of rules that people are playing with in the climbing. Those are all wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things. And I would just hope, if, you know, insofar you're asking, would people be interested in these kinds of conversations? I would hope so. I think they would get a lot out of it. And I agree with Steve. We should be doing more of this kind of thing. I think it's actually kind of beneficial.
That's great. So yeah, we're a little over time, but I think it was very fruitful. I can't thank you guys enough for joining us today, and hopefully we can maybe come together sometime in the future and do it again.
Let us
Well,
know.
thank you very much. I've really
Thanks very
enjoyed
much.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Great to meet everybody.
Yeah, really good, really good.